What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
The elections are over, but we're not going anywhere. Presidential appointments are being announced. Republicans now have full control of Congress, and we're transitioning from the election period into the governing period. We have a lot to talk about. Welcome to episode 18. I'm here with my partner, Todd Kent. And today we have a special guest, Heath Brown, who's going to help us make sense of the transition period. Heath, tell me if I get anything wrong here, but in terms of my notes, you're an associate professor of public policy at the John Jay College at the City University of New York. What I really like about your record, in addition to being a really great academic, you also have policy experience. You worked for the U.S. Congressional Budget Office as an education research fellow, the American Bus Association as a policy assistant. But your academic research, a lot of what you do is the study of transitions, of moving from elections to governing. We forget this might be the most important part of a democracy, right? Not the election itself, but the transfer of power.
Well, thank you for having me, and you've gotten everything right, including the motivation for my research, which was based on this time that I spent in Washington, D.C., about a decade while I was going to graduate school. I worked nearly the entirety of the time of my graduate program for the Bus Association and for the Council of Graduate Schools, which is a higher ed association based in DuPont Circle. But through all of those experiences, a decade of my life, when I thought I was such an insider, I thought I really understood how Washington worked. But when I left, which was right at the point at which there was a presidential transition coming up, I realized I knew nothing about presidential transitions. I had never met anyone on a transition. I had never worked on a transition. How could it be that this really important thing was something I had no understanding of? It's what motivated me to study this for the exact reason that you say, which is how important for the democracy the transfer of power is. That's what's happening right now. That's why so much attention should be placed on this. That's why I spend so much of my time thinking and studying this. And so it's great to be here.
Well, and so one of the things that I really like, this is a hard thing to study. I mean, I want to get into the details of what you think is going on in the transition process and whether the lessons learned from the last transition, whether they're being applied, and what sort of things we should be paying attention to. But just in terms of studying the transition process, this is a hard assignment, right?
It's so hard. And one of the reasons for that is because historically, through American history, the winning president would typically spend the time after Election Day on vacation. They would almost literally and almost always go on vacation, go to the beach. And numerous presidents were sort of famous for spending the time after the election literally at the beach, trying to rest up. I mean, the reason for that is quite obvious. The campaign, a process of campaign is exhausting for the candidate, exhausting for the person's campaign team. And as a result, tradition had held that what happened after was that everyone sort of took some time off. Increasingly over the 20th century, there was a recognition that this was just not the right way to approach this time period. It wasn't effective for the incoming administration. They often sacrificed their agenda to Congress, who didn't take a vacation after the election. But more important than that, it opened up a potential security vacuum. That it was incredibly risky for the safety and security of the country not to approach the transition period with as much rigor and thought as once the administration is up and running. And so during the 1960s, during the height of the Cold War, the country, Congress, and incoming administration said we have to do this in a more professional, organized, and institutional way. And what has happened since then, since about 1963, has been an ever more institutionalized, organized, and effective way to move the outgoing administration out and the incoming administration in a seamless, conflict-free way. That's the direction that we've seen over the last 50, 60, 70 years.
So as we look towards the Trump transition, have you seen a shift kind of in the way transitions are working? You said that it's more professional, more organized, but are we seeing, I was reading where the average time to get the average cabinet official nominated has grown greatly over the last two transitions. Are you seeing, is this going to continue? Are we seeing, is this an aberration?
Well, this transition is unlike any transition we've had before. The direction that we had seen, and I think the 2008 transition from George W. Bush to Barack Obama has been held up as the kind of the gold standard. It's considered the gold standard for partially what George W. Bush said to his White House, which is, we will welcome the incoming administration in as if we had campaigned for them. He said something to that effect, which is to say that the campaign is done and the time for governance has started. That sent a message across the federal government that cooperation and teamwork were the name of the game. And so the incoming Obama-Biden administration was able to work so closely with the outgoing administration, it was as if there was no period of uncertainty about who was in control of the U.S. government. I think that sent a very powerful message to the world. I sent a very powerful message about the continuity of government, which is so important for a democracy to be strong and secure. Recently, that commitment to teamwork and cooperation has been in great jeopardy. One of the problems of that is exacerbates the kind of problem that you just described, Todd, which is the delays in getting appointments made. One of the reasons why George W. Bush was so adamant about the transfer of power being seamless was what we learned from the 9/11 Commission. And the 9/11 Commission said that one of the contributing factors to what happened on 9/11 was the security void that happened after the election. That is, the national security team that George W. Bush was trying to bring in took much longer than it should have. It was delayed. It meant that the team wasn't in place for far too long. And that meant that they weren't ready as a team to be able to absorb the security and intelligence about what was being planned for 9/11. He swore that wouldn't happen again, but that hasn't changed the very delayed appointment process. It's one of the main things that slows an incoming administration from meeting its goals, which is having the full team ready to go on day one. That's something that the incoming administration right now is trying to do. They're trying to move very quickly, especially with the cabinet appointments, but that still doesn't mean that the Senate confirmation process is going to work any more quickly than it has in the past. That's a real factor to consider when trying to evaluate what an incoming administration is doing well or doing poorly.
There's this real tension, too, that is between sort of the career civil servant part of the bureaucracy versus the political appointees. And you talk about it in your book, Roadblocked, Joe Biden's Rocky Transition to the Presidency, about how if 2008 was sort of the model of what a good transition looks like, 2020 was not a beautiful transition, but it still worked. And part of the reason it worked was because of the career civil servant. Do we have... And did I get that right? And then also, if I did, do we have worries given Trump's concern about deep state, concern about bureaucracy, concern about changing the way that career civil servants are hired and fired, that maybe this transition won't be so smooth?
Yeah, so just to look back 4 years to what happened in 2020, 2021, in the heat of the pandemic, with thousands of people dying each day, the Biden-Harris transition team was working entirely from home. Though there was a transition facility set up for them in Washington, no one could access it because it simply wasn't safe to do so. And so they had thousands of people working from home, trying to collect up the information necessary to deal with the pandemic, first and foremost, deal with the economic situation. They did so, as every incoming administration does, by trying to get information from the outgoing administration, and as importantly, from the career bureaucrats who are going to remain after the outgoing administration leaves. That's typically done in face-to-face meetings. That's what always happens. In 2020, when I talked to people that were involved in the Biden-Harris transition, they told me a variety of things about how cooperative the outgoing administration was. Though we learned in newspapers at the time about the obstruction, the so-called obstruction that was happening during that time period, many of the people that I talked to didn't describe obstruction. They described outgoing teams, agencies that were actually quite cooperative. They set up meetings, they shared information, they were doing basically what was expected and what had happened in the past. So that was one of the things that I learned in the book from talking to people that were involved, that in many agencies, this was pretty normal, with a couple of exceptions. And those exceptions are where people told me about incredible resistance from the outgoing administration, particularly from the political appointees that were unwilling to share information, that would say to their faces that they didn't think they were legitimate, despite the fact that they had won the election, despite the fact that the transition had begun. Political appointees said they just didn't think that they were legitimate and they wouldn't share information. That was incredibly problematic because that was often in the areas of sharing intelligence. Intelligence is something that is so critical during the transition because it's the very information that only the sitting administration has. It's national security intelligence that has to be shared during the transition so that on day one, the incoming administration doesn't have to learn for the first time all of the challenges that are happening exactly at that moment. Foreign adversaries don't wait to give the new administration a couple weeks to get ready. They're potentially ready on day one to strike, possibly.
Heath,
it's why the sharing of information was so very important. That didn't happen to a great extent in some important areas in 2020. The question for this year is whether it's going to happen. I've got some thoughts on that, but I think that's one of the biggest questions that we're looking at right now.
So Heath, we've incoming President Trump has signaled some of his nominations, and they're talking about it. There seems to be a lot of pushback by the opposition party. So what do you think? Is this bigger deal than past transitions, or is this more of the same?
Well, I think the biggest surprise here is that a lot of the pushback isn't coming from Democrats, it's coming from Republicans. And so on a number of those cabinet nominations that have been made, we're hearing prominent, especially Senate Republicans, saying that they don't believe that the people that have been chosen are fit for the positions, that they're going to face difficulty in the confirmation process. We always hear the opposition party raising questions about who the nominees are going to be, even though they know that almost every nominee typically gets approved. We see often one or two maybe that get caught up. I think one of the questions this year is it going to be more than one or two? Is it going to be 3, 4, or 5? Again, we're early in this transition. We haven't seen all of the appointments. We've actually seen just a fraction. Remember, we're talking about something in the order of 1,000 Senate-approved positions that the incoming administration has to decide on. And that's in addition to about 3,000 non-approved positions. This is a huge personnel and staffing operation. The quality of the vetting that they do of these candidates is really important for their success in getting their team in place. The questions that have already been asked is whether the full and effective vetting has happened with all of these nominees. Given the process that they've used to decide on some of them, I think that's a question with an obvious answer. I think we're going to see a lot more things come up because the vetting process, which in 2020 was so comprehensive, hundreds of vetting attorneys combing over every little detail of each and every one of those nominees. It's not clear right now that the Trump transition team is staffed up enough to actually carry out the vetting necessary to figure out whether each and every one of these people has a clear background that can get them through the confirmation process. I think that's something that we're going to see that's very different than the past. Whether this team is ready to do this work, I don't think we know that right now.
So, not to interrupt,
No,
just
go
to
ahead.
follow up on that, it seems like we've kind of moved over the years into where a lot of the people that are nominated are symbolic of something, as opposed to somebody of substance, meaning that your Treasury Secretary came out of the financial world. Now we see or and stuff like that. So, as that happens, is the logical consequence that there's going to be more trouble getting them actually appointed by the Senate, or confirmed by the Senate? And so because of this fact that there is a perception that this person is not substantively prepared for this job, although they may be symbolically what the incoming president wants.
I think every incoming administration loves to nominate members of Congress to important positions. That's in part because they're often issue experts. And so you nominate somebody who had been the chair of the banking committee to Treasury because they bring a lot of expertise. But as important as that is the question you just asked. Anyone who has been elected to Congress has been vetted, if not completely, pretty thoroughly. And they've been vetted, and they often won multiple elections. And so if skeletons exist in their closets, those have probably already been aired. If somebody hasn't been elected to office, become a governor or a mayor or a member of Congress, member of the Senate, if they haven't gone through that, then they probably haven't been through a full vetting. And if you haven't been through a full vetting, it means that there are things that you may not have had to address. We've seen that in the past when people have not been through an electoral process. And in those situations, you tend to have the most issues come up. So if you're looking at the current array of people who have been nominated to this cabinet, it's in those areas where people haven't been through the electoral process, haven't had a proper vetting in the past. The burden then comes down on the transition team to do that work. It's very time consuming. It's something that has to start long before the election. And if it doesn't, you're likely to miss things. And so I think that every time we see somebody, a business executive who hasn't been elected to Congress previously, nominated for a position, that's where you see these potential conflicts and skeletons possibly arise.
So it feels like, and we need to, it feels like some of these decisions have been made by Trump not a year out, but maybe on the fly, and maybe that's just Trump's style because he's often sort of acts like he's acting from the gut, even if maybe he's given more thought to this. I have a quote here from Peter Baker, who called this transition a generational test of a stress test for the political system. Is that how you see it? What are your thoughts on this transition, and what are the things especially that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think that what we saw prior to the election, which is called the pre-election transition period, what I think we saw from the Trump team is a pretty some established leaders chosen to run the team. And so they chose a former member of the Trump cabinet, Linda McMahon, who had run the Small Business Administration, knowledgeable about Washington, knowledgeable about the federal government. They also chose the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, knowledgeable about the finance sector, knowledgeable about staffing and personnel. I think they made clearly good decisions to affiliate themselves with this think tank AFPI for a while, the organization that Linda McMahon is the chair of. I think the signals prior to the election were pretty good that the effective transition planning was going on. One of the problems is that in 2016, the same thing was going on. Prior to the Trump victory in 2016, Governor Chris Christie was carrying out a pretty traditional and effective transition, getting ready to govern. But as soon as Trump won in 2016, they tore up all of the plans that Chris Christie had been making, almost literally threw them in the trash. I think one of the things that I'm very curious about right now is whether the pre-election transition planning that had been done, overseen by McMahon and Lutnick, is relied upon, or to what extent is President-elect Trump disregarding all of that advice and planning for his own gut sense of who the right cabinet officials are. That, I think, is going to determine a lot about the effectiveness of this transition. How much are they relying on the careful planning that had been going on versus the tendency of the Trump circle to shoot from the hip, make very last-minute decisions based on criteria that aren't always related to effective governance, related to things that often are sort of how media-friendly appointees are and how much public appeal decisions might have. That's, I think, a critical point that we're at that we don't have an answer for yet, but is something I'm paying a lot of attention to.
Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your expertise. We've always said that when we don't know enough about a topic, we're going to go out and find someone who can explain it to us. I think you've done an amazing job here, and really love the book and love your work on presidential transition. So thank you so much. We appreciate your being here.
Kirby and Todd, thank you so much. Thanks for reading the book and love the podcast. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
And when we come back, we'll talk about what else is going on in politics this week.
I'm thinking I'm in trouble here. So they roll me straight into an OR. The big old triple light is sitting there, and there's like literally a surgeon sitting there with a scalpel in his hand. And he said, "I'm so-and-so. I've got to perform emergency surgery on you, like right now." And I said, "If I don't make it, tell my family I love them." And then they gassed me out. And that was it.
KAMU Studios presents Aggie Bonfire Collapse 25 years later. Watch now at tx.ag/bonfire@25.
From the New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro. This is The Daily.
North Korea will blow up its nuclear test site. Actually, the North Koreans invited me to go watch that happen.
Did they?
They did.
Have you RSVP'd?
No, I frankly felt that was kind of theatrical.
The Daily from The New York Times.
Weekdays at 5:30 on Aggieland's Public Radio, KAMU-FM.
Todd, it's pretty amazing, I think, in American politics, moving from the period of the election to the period of governance and watching the transition as an incoming administration gets ready to gets ready to govern. And we do forget, I think, sometimes just how important this period is and that this is the critical point of democracy. I always tell my students, the most important election isn't the first election, it's the election when we change power, when we have a new party come in. And watching the transition from Joe Biden to Donald Trump, from Trump to Biden to Trump, we're worried about democracy, but that should be a little reassuring, I think.
No, actually, I think sometimes because it's so current, and so, we're living on a daily basis, we think it's different than the past. But no, we've seen this before. And I know that I told my students that, look, in the course of my life, my candidates have won and lost over many times, and we're still here. And I think that's the reassuring thing. We're watching democracy work, and we're seeing people posture and to kind of take positions, but that's okay. That's what they're supposed to do. And I think one thing that's really interesting here is will we see the reemergence of the House and the Senate?
Yeah.
Because the difference between the parties as far as numbers in the House and Senate have been so close, it's been hard for them to get things done. Mm-hmm. And so the president, I think, has been the beneficiary of that. Will we see some power go back to the House and the Senate, or see them take up that power?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think you got two issues, I think, after an election, if you're thinking about sort of ongoing politics, but one of them is Trump's win was decisive. The Republican win was decisive, but it's still really narrow. And I think it's easier to forget because Trump won all those swing states and he gained votes throughout. The divisions between us are still very, very narrow. This is still a very divided country. And so it's easy for an incoming president to overreach. It's easy for Trump, because of divisions within the Republican Party, to even overreach within his own party. And I think Heath was getting at some of this, and we were talking a little bit about it, is, he comes in with nominees that maybe they're not even real. His own party has concerns about. Matt Gaetz, I think, is the prime example, because he's not well loved among other Republicans. Kevin McCarthy, he helped take down a speaker. It's really sort of fascinating to watch. Trump may be overreaching, not only overinterpreting his win in terms of what he can do relative to Democrats, but even within Republican factions within his own party.
No, there's no doubt about it. It makes you kind of ask the question, are some of these appointments to try to reassure the base that you did the right thing, that kind of I'm signaling that this whole thing I've been talking about throughout the campaign, it's going to continue, or is there an idea that this is the best person for that job? And I think we forget the political nature of what's going on. We see the incoming members of the Senate and the House. They're posturing for the next election. They're setting themselves up to do their constitutional duties in the same way the president is. So there's a lot of kind of posturing going on, and I think nominations play into that.
Yeah, and in some ways, we were. Is Trump playing a game with some of these nominations where what he's putting up is someone who he knows that the Senate's not going to confirm everyone, or at least there's going to be a nasty fight over at least one of his nominations. So does he just give him one? Give him a Matt Gaetz so that they can fight it out over a Matt Gaetz, or is he serious about wanting Gaetz in the Justice Department? And I wish I knew. I don't know. There's this great quote about Gaetz that when other people were interviewing for the Justice Department, they came in and they talked about law and they talked about the Constitution and sort of a very standard Justice Department review. And Gaetz came in and told Trump he wanted to be in there because he wanted to cut heads. And so is Trump looking for his vengeance tour, or is he looking for someone who can be effective in governing? And those are two very different things.
Well, if you think back to the last 4 years, the group that has caused Donald Trump the most trouble is the Department of Justice.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
So it's kind of it's interesting that the kind of the nominee that's being talked about is the nominee for the Department of Justice. This idea that there's going to be that heads need to roll and that there needs to be some changes, and so we're gonna see that, I think, played out within the Senate and certainly in the world of public opinion.
Yeah, there's also this real balance in terms of nominees, and you can say I think it's fair to argue we could overstate the trade-off, but I do think there is a trade-off here, and it's especially true when you're dealing with a Donald Trump, between loyalty and expertise. In order to effectively govern, you need someone in these departments who understands the bureaucracy that they're working in, who understands the career civil servants, who can move the bureaucracy. But those people are not always the most loyal. Sometimes their loyalties are more to the agency or more to the mission of the agency and less to the president. And that creates a real tension in terms of some of these nominees. And it looks like, at least so, Marco Rubio looks like he's a pretty consistent standard nominee for Secretary of State, but then you get into a Tulsi Gabbard for National Intelligence, or you get into the Matt Gaetz for Justice, or you get into the Hegseth for the Department of Defense. All of those look more like they're loyalty-based and less expertise-based.
Certainly, I think it would be hard to come to any other conclusion that Trump has chosen apart from loyalty. I think he's focused on who's going to be loyalty, and I think I've heard him say and kind of say out loud that maybe that was one of the mistakes he made in the first go around, was getting people who turned out to not be that loyal. Mm-hmm. Now that has a positives and negatives, certainly. I think also we're seeing this transition, or maybe it just seems like it to me, is that where we put somebody ahead of one of these cabinet positions, but we know the real work on a day-to-day basis is done by kind of a few political appointees below them, and the career civil servants. So there's a whole group working to help make decisions, and so now the person in our media world that we live in becomes more as a symbol, as opposed to somebody that's actually rolling up their sleeves and doing the dirty work.
Yeah, but the difference potentially the difference with Trump on just sort of having, you can imagine the symbolic head and then the lower officials pretty much running the day-to-day. This is true of a lot of large organizations. We can think about football teams, the head coach versus the coordinators, universities, the president versus the provost and the vice presidents and the deans, and so forth. But with Trump, there is also this interest in going after some of those career civil servants who he thought were resistant to change, and moving away a little bit from a career civil service and more towards the old Andrew Jackson spoil system. I don't think we're going full spoil system, but certainly some willingness to be able to move people from a category that's more protected, that's less protected, so that they can be fired if they seem to be resistant to change.
Yeah, I think certainly. I agree with you. I think there's this the loyalty aspect is so critical to Trump right now, and that opens up this door, or begs the question: what kind of decision-making apparatus is he going to put around him?
Yeah,
we know that presidents over time, and we'll talk more about this in the future, I'm sure. Some presidents wanted disagreement among their people so they could get good decisions. Others had more of a traditional hierarchy in their administration where the decisions kind of rolled up to the top. So there's different ways of doing it. It seems like to me that Trump wants a small group who's making decisions, and I think history shows that can be sometimes problematic.
Yeah, the danger is the danger of those two different systems, right, is if you don't have enough disagreement, you don't have the person in the room who's able to check the groupthink, able to check the idea that everybody there agrees and is seeing the same thing, or that the people in the room are afraid to tell Donald Trump no, or afraid to tell him that he's wrong, or afraid to push back on something. And leaders need that person. But if you have too much of that, then it makes it hard to effectively govern, because then you have too much disagreement and there's battles over power and over who's the loudest voice in the room. And so it really is tricky in terms of organizing the presidency. And it does seem like Trump's ideal system is to have a small circle of people who are mostly aligned in terms of their level of agreement.
Yeah, and it's if you look at some of the most high-profile people he's talked about aren't even cabinet members. Like
right.
the Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. Taking the axe to government. Fat. If you can say, or reducing the budget deficit. So which are not subject to confirmation hearings in the Senate. So it's a very interesting kind of way of governing. It remains to be seen whether it's going to be, we're going to look back here in 4 years and say it was really different, he went about a different way, or if it eventually, the inertia of Washington, D.C. itself takes you back to the standard way of governing.
Yeah, we definitely have an Elon Musk and Donald Trump bromance, brewing. It's interesting to think about how long that can last, because they share a lot of concerns and a lot of issues, especially in terms of economy and some regulation. But they also, you can see where there are there's a lot of potential for disagreement going forward on tech. It looks like in terms of the regulation of tech, in terms of a lot of potential disagreement coming out of that relationship and that structure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, are we going to see a Donald Trump that can be checked by his own peoples and him be okay with it? And I think that's going to be very important, how it governs, because he's done a good job of getting other people outside of government involved in his campaign and hopefully in governing. But can you maintain that? Because a lot of people, they have their own lives, their own power, and they don't necessarily need to do that.
Yeah, and one of the things we hit on was this idea of the relative strength of the president versus the Congress and the Senate, and moving more and more towards executive governance, which is what we've been doing over the last several presidencies, where a lot of governing is done by executive order, a lot of governing is done through changes in the federal bureaucracy and control over administrative decision making. It's curious that some of the appointments may make it harder to govern that way, and so there have been some folks there have been some columnists who have made the case and made the argument that Trump's already set up for failure because he needs to be focused on his policy priorities, and this is all going to distract from his policy priorities going forward.
You know, the old joke is that the federal bureaucracy looks at the incoming administration as Christmas help. You know, if we just wait them out, they're going to be gone in a few years. So they can resist. It's as you go down kind of the levels, they can resist very strongly compared to, and so it's hard to make massive changes. It's like it is sometimes changing the federal government's like, you know, turning the Titanic, I guess you could say. But it's very difficult because of that fact. There's so many, it's so big that it's hard to have a major shift.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that Donald Trump's victory was decisive but narrow. I just wanted to throw this as an electoral college victory. It's less than Obama in 2008 or in 2012. It's less than Clinton in 92 or 96. It's less than George H.W. Bush in 88. It's, of course, much less than Ronald Reagan. In terms of the margin of vote, we're still calculating, but the numbers look kind of similar. I did a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation. In 2016 and 2020, it was about 100,000 votes you could move across the swing states to change the winner. In this election cycle, it's about 272,000 votes. So this idea that we're still narrowly divided. All along lead-in, probably unnecessarily long, but to get at the Democratic Party is licking its wounds and trying to figure out where to go from here. You know, as often the case when there's a losing party, they're trying to figure out what the path forward is. A lot of voices are being heard. One of them, Bernie Sanders, saying, "We forgot the working class and we deserve this." Other people are saying, "No, we can't move too far to the left. We have to stay in the center." I don't know. They may be overthinking this, huh? Maybe the thing to do is if Trump succeeds, he succeeds and it makes it harder to win. If he fails, you probably have a pretty good case for the presidency in 2028.
Yeah, you know, if you look at it, it's much closer than people think. What kind of the perception that it wasn't is because the Trump was able to win all the swing states that we call them, or the important states, and that was significant, even though they were all by fairly small margins. As 100,000 votes, is that a small margin across the state? Yeah, it's not that large. So I think we think of it as a huge victory. There are some bad signals for the Democrats, and that is that a lot of the different groups that we look at move to the right. Even I read this morning where Nancy Pelosi's district moved 7 points towards Trump. Yeah. Which is one of the most liberal districts in the country, and so, if we look at the border of Texas and Mexico down there in the valley, huge shifts.
Yeah.
And so is this a one-time thing? I actually think the most important thing in the election was the economy.
Absolutely.
And so if the economy doesn't change or go in a manner that the voters like it, will we see a shift back in the future?
Yeah, it's a really interesting election cycle because it is at once decisive, but also we are still pretty narrowly divided. And the question for the Democratic Party is, what does the future look like? What voice wins? And so, we're always watching this to see, because parties are not monolithic. There are a lot of different factions within the parties, and those factions contest for power. And so what we're seeing in the Democratic Party right now is a contest for power between a more centrist version of the Democratic Party that believes the problems with the party were they went too far left, and they got positioned as out of the mainstream on issues like transgender issues, and so they were too far gone. Versus the left that says, no, we went too far center. We didn't stand for anything. We didn't fight for the working class. We told the working class, don't worry about your economic problems. You're fine. And that fight's going to determine in the future the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and I think that's something we forget is both the Republican Party has factions. We're going to see that with the Matt Gaetz nomination, and then the Democrats have their own set of factions. And then so there is, even though we don't have a proportional system like they have in Europe, we actually do have lots of factions within the different parties. So we're going to see this. I think the Democrats, hopefully they're going to, I think they should realize that they were focused on the wrong things. They didn't understand what the voter was interested in this election. Now, can the Republicans capitalize that and continue that on in the future remains to be seen. And that's why it's important that I think as you talk about what's the new administration going to focus on, if it's a kind of we're going to get our enemies, I think they're going to be the loser in the future.
Right.
I think what they have to do is to set a clear agenda and a smaller agenda than maybe they would like to, and focus on those things.
Yep.
And then convince the public if it doesn't happen, it's not the president's fault, it's somebody else's fault. You know?
Yeah, but and to your point, I think that the real future of both political parties, I think, it will be determined in part by the effectiveness of the Trump administration in terms of dealing with the economy, dealing with the immigration problem, and immigration issues, and in dealing with the issues. The voters voted for them looking for change, and they wanted economic change, and they wanted change in terms of border policy. Now the question is, can they deliver? And if they deliver on those can they enact what they said they wanted to do? And then if they enact what they said they wanted to do, will we see the results? Because voters are very much, is my life better or is my life worse? So that's sort of the central question for both parties right now, I think.
No, I think that's true. And to be able, what it does, it takes governing discipline to focus on those areas and to put your whole kind of a communications team out there focusing on this is what we're doing, and that so I think that's going to be difficult because I think Donald Trump has an opinion on most everything. And he likes, and so, but can you stay? You can't do everything. You mentioned earlier, kind of government overreach. And I think there's this idea that presidents win, and every time the president wins, they say we have a mandate.
Right.
Well, really, they don't have a mandate, and we see that quickly because Congress has its own power, and there's the bureaucracy has its own power, and there's going to be a lot of opposition. But what they can do is focus on the things that cross boundaries. What I mean by that is things that the Democrats care about too, and then I think it becomes more difficult to stop what they're doing.
One other sort of sign of division, I love these charts, and I love seeing them, is before the election, Republicans were very negative about the economy. Democrats were more positive about the economy. After the election, almost immediately as soon as Trump is elected, the lines cross. And so now Republicans are more positive have become significantly more positive about the economy, and Democrats have become significantly negative. Now, I know I don't want to just make fun of voters here because I don't think they're reacting because a lot of it is based on expectation, and the expectation that the economy will get better. And there have been some initial signs that suggest the economy may be improving, or that investments may be coming forward. So
I think that's true. Some of those numbers are just pure partisanship. My people are in power now, and I'm negative because my people lost. So that there's that. But the key thing is somebody has to deliver, and I think Donald Trump has to deliver on some of his promises, or some of this shift to him may be soft. And so it's gonna be. That's why I if I was his advisor, I'd say a narrow agenda, especially for the first 100 days,
Yeah.
200 days, and let's focus on these things so everybody knows that this is what we're doing. And then over time, you can do some of the things you want to do.
Yeah, I know you remember this. Some of our listeners may be too young to remember the movie, but a great political movie, The Candidate, with Robert Redford, where he's running for Senate, and they're completely focused on the campaign. At the end of the movie, he wins, and it ends with him saying, "Now what?"
Yeah.
and I think that's where we are now. We're in the now what stage of moving from elections to governing. We'll already see politicking for future elections start right away because we live in a never-ending campaign cycle. But really now we're thinking about what can the administration do and can they effectively solve problems.
Over the week, as I was listening to the news over the weekend, there was actually somebody was making the case that if we do these things right, we can be successful in 2026. And I thought, we literally are a week out from the 2024 elections, and they're already talking about posturing for 2026. But that's the way it works, and actually, that makes our democracy self-correcting. Is that if we don't perform, then eventually they'll throw us out. And I think that several people have said that was even if your candidate didn't win, there's something about this idea that you can't overreach because the people will bring you back.
Yeah, one of the great political science theories about this compares it to a thermostat. So when the Democrats get in, maybe they turn the temperature to where it's too cold, and then Republicans come in and they're like, it's too cold in here, we need to turn it till it's too hot. Or they turn it until it then is too hot, and then Democrats come back in and turn it again. So we're constantly adjusting, trying to get to that right temperature, and we almost always never are because either party is going to take it too far in one direction versus the other.
Yeah, it's true, and it's interesting. I think to look at one thing that in my research was on presidential job approval.
Yeah,
and Trump, even his first administration, had a hard time getting above 50%. Yeah. And Joe Biden, I don't know if he ever got above 50%. So historically, presidents would start pretty high, and everybody was kind of encouraged by them and confident. And then as they made decisions, it would begin to decline.
Right.
But the last couple of presidents have started low and kind of stayed there, more of a flat line. So it'll be interesting to see if the Trump administration can win people over, or is it just so close and it's just we'll see that flat line again as job approval?
Well, since we're in the now what phase, we're going to keep following. We're going to follow closely what President Trump and the Trump administration is trying to accomplish, what the Democrats are trying to do in opposition, how the factions within both parties are fighting it out for the future of the parties and for the future of the country. But that's it for this episode. Todd, always great.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/Inside Political Science. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolicy@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.